What if everything you believed about your past was a lie? Nathaniel Whitmore had it all: money, power, success. In his world, the past was something you buried, and emotions were just obstacles on the path to greatness. But one freezing night, a single ring shattered his reality. He thought she was gone forever. He thought she had walked away without a trace. He thought she had betrayed him. But when he saw her again, ragged, exhausted, clutching two children on the streets of Ashford, nothing made sense anymore. How did the woman he once loved end up like this? And why was she wearing the ring he gave her all those years ago? What happened to Eleanor? The truth would shake him to his core. Lies, betrayal, and a cruel twist of fate had stolen their future, but was it too late to make things right? Stay with me, because this story will make you question everything you thought you knew about love, trust, and second chances. The wind howled through the towering skyscrapers of Ashford, weaving through alleys and empty streets, cutting through layers of expensive wool and faux fur like a merciless blade. It was the kind of night that made people rush to the warmth of their homes, the kind that turned the city's forgotten souls into shadows blending with the pavement. Nathaniel Whitmore stepped out of the sleek black Mercedes that had just pulled up to the entrance of an exclusive restaurant on Hanover Street. The sharp scent of roasted duck and aged wine lingered in the air as the door swung closed behind him. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored coat, barely acknowledging the valet who had just parked his car. His mind was elsewhere, on stock projections, international deals, the empire he had built with his own hands. Success had hardened him. Time had stripped away sentimentality. He lived in numbers, transactions, and acquisitions, not in memories or regrets. Then he saw her. Across the street, pressed against the cold brick wall of an abandoned shop, was a woman. Her frame was shrouded in an old, tattered coat that barely reached past her knees. Her arms cradled two small figures, both wrapped in layers of mismatched clothing, their faces barely visible beneath scarves and woolen hats. A mother and her children. Nathaniel's jaw clenched. The sight wasn't new. Homelessness had always been part of Ashford's underbelly, ignored by those who lived above it. He had passed by countless beggars before, indifferent to their existence. This time should have been no different. He should have walked past them like he always did, stepping into his warm car, away from their suffering. But then something caught his eye. The woman adjusted the coat around one of the children, and as she did, the sleeve of her worn sweater slid down, revealing her hand. A silver ring glinted under the glow of the street lamp. Nathaniel felt the world tilt. His breath caught in his throat, a strange, suffocating pressure constricting his chest. He knew that ring. He had seen it before, long ago on fingers that once traced lazy patterns on his palm, on a hand that once held his in the quiet of the night. A ring that should have never been here, not like this, not wrapped around frozen fingers that trembled against the cold. His feet moved before his mind could catch up, carrying him across the street, toward the woman who had haunted his past. She looked up just as he stopped in front of her. Dark eyes met his, worn, exhausted, but unmistakably familiar. Nathaniel felt his stomach drop. "Eleanor?" The woman's lips parted, her breath a cloud of white mist in the freezing air. Shock flickered across her face, followed by something else, something guarded, something almost fearful. She took a step back, instinctively pulling the children closer. Nathaniel barely registered the movement. His gaze was fixed on the ring, the same ring he had once given to her, a lifetime ago, when love still meant something, when the world hadn't yet turned them into strangers. His pulse roared in his ears. "Where did you get that ring?" His voice came out harsher than he intended. Eleanor swallowed, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her coat. For a moment, she didn't answer. The silence between them stretched, heavy, filled with years of unspoken words. Finally, she lifted her chin slightly, her voice hoarse from the cold. "It was my mother's." A pause. Then softer, almost hesitant. "You gave it to me." Nathaniel felt as if the ground had been ripped from under him. It was her, Eleanor, the woman he had once loved, the woman he had once promised forever, the woman who had vanished from his life without a trace. And now she was here, on the streets, frozen, homeless, with two children. Nathaniel opened his mouth, but no words came. His mind raced, struggling to bridge the impossible gap between the Eleanor he had known and the woman standing before him now. Eleanor, who had once danced barefoot in the summer rain, who had once whispered dreams into his ear under the city skyline. Eleanor, who had been laughter and warmth, fire and defiance. Now she was silent, a ghost of the woman he remembered. The little girl beside her whimpered, shifting against her mother's side. The boy, older, maybe 10, watched Nathaniel with wary eyes, his small hand gripping Eleanor's coat tightly. Nathaniel's gaze flickered between them, realization dawning like a slow-burning fire in his chest. Were they her children? His throat tightened. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to be in this moment. The past was no longer just a memory. It was here, breathing, waiting. And for the first time in years, Nathaniel Whitmore, the man who had built an empire, who had walked away from emotions because they had no place in his world of power and wealth, felt utterly lost. The city was alive with movement, but for Nathaniel, time had slowed. The streetlights cast a dull yellow glow over Eleanor's face, illuminating the dark circles under her eyes, the way her cheekbones jutted out just a little too sharply. She had always been beautiful, radiant, confident. Now she looked like a shadow of the woman he once knew, someone who had been stripped down to the raw edges of survival. His mind struggled to process it. Eleanor, his Eleanor, standing in front of him on the freezing streets of Ashford with 2 children clinging to her, looking at him like he was a ghost. Or maybe she was the ghost. She hadn't answered him yet, not really. She had only said what he already knew, that the ring had been hers, that he had given it to her. Nathaniel swallowed, his throat dry. The wind howled between them, stirring the ragged edges of Eleanor's coat. The little girl beside her shivered violently, tucking her face against her mother's side, while the boy, slightly taller, stood stiff and alert, his wary eyes never leaving Nathaniel's face. Something about that look twisted a knife deep in his gut. Who had taught that boy to be so guarded, so prepared for the worst? Nathaniel cleared his throat, forcing words past the lump forming there. Eleanor, what happened to you? Her lips parted, but for a moment she said nothing. A dozen emotions flickered across her face. Shock, hesitation, something like anger. Then just as quickly it was gone, replaced by cold detachment. What are you doing here, Nathaniel? She asked instead, her voice steady but brittle, like glass ready to shatter. The question caught him off guard. He blinked, glancing back at the upscale restaurant behind him, the warmth spilling out onto the sidewalk where people, wrapped in fine coats and laughter, walked past without sparing them a glance. He suddenly felt absurd, out of place in his tailored wool coat, his Italian shoes, standing before a woman who had once meant everything to him but whom he hadn't seen in over a decade. What was he doing here? Nathaniel exhaled sharply, forcing his gaze back to her. I could ask you the same thing. His voice came out harsher than he intended, laced with emotions he hadn't yet named. How the hell did you end up like this? A muscle in Eleanor's jaw twitched. She looked away, tucking the little girl closer into her coat, as if to shield her from his words. The boy's grip on her tightened. Nathaniel ran a hand through his hair, frustration and disbelief warring inside him. This wasn't supposed to happen. Eleanor was supposed to have a good life. She had been brilliant, determined, stronger than anyone he had ever known. He had never imagined, never even considered the possibility that she could end up on the streets. Finally, she spoke. Life happened, Nathaniel. The words were quiet, but they landed like a punch to his gut. Life happened. As if that explained everything, as if it was that simple. His fingers curled into fists. That's not an answer, he said. You disappeared. He stopped himself, jaw tightening. He wasn't sure what he had been about to say. He had moved on, buried her memory, built a life without her. Hadn't he? Eleanor let out a breath, turning to glance at the children, then back at him. I don't owe you answers, Nathaniel. Her voice was calm, but there was a quiet fire behind it, a familiar fire. The Eleanor he remembered had always been like that, fierce in a way that didn't need to be loud. And yet, despite everything, she looked tired, beyond tired. He opened his mouth to argue, but then the little girl made a soft, pitiful sound. Eleanor reacted instantly, kneeling beside her, brushing back her frizzy curls. The child's lips were pale, her tiny hands clutching at the fabric of her mother's coat. Nathaniel's stomach twisted. Are they yours? He asked before he could stop himself. Eleanor stiffened but didn't look at him. Instead, she adjusted the girl's scarf, then glanced at the boy, who was watching the exchange like a silent protector. Yes, Nathaniel exhaled sharply. Of course they were. He didn't know why it hit him the way it did. Maybe because it meant that Eleanor hadn't just been fighting for herself all these years. She had been fighting for them too. His gaze dropped to the girl, her small hands, her round cheeks, her deep brown eyes, Eleanor's eyes. The boy, though, something about him sent a strange, sharp ache through Nathaniel's chest. Nathaniel tore his gaze away. None of this made sense. Where's their father? The question came out before he could stop it. Eleanor finally looked at him. Her eyes were colder than the wind whipping between them. Gone. One word. Sharp. Final. Nathaniel had the distinct feeling she wasn't talking about death. 1,000 more questions burned on his tongue, but he swallowed them down. The boy shifted slightly, pressing closer to Eleanor, and for the first time, Nathaniel noticed how thin his coat was, how his fingers, curled into small fists, were red from the cold. His stomach twisted again. "Where are you staying?" Eleanor hesitated. That was enough of an answer. A sharp exhale left him. She had nowhere. Nathaniel ran a hand down his face, his mind a whirlwind of emotions he wasn't ready to name. He didn't know why he cared. He didn't know why his heart was pounding like this, why his pulse was in his ears, why everything inside him screamed that he couldn't just walk away. Maybe because Eleanor wasn't just some stranger on the street. Maybe because this was Eleanor, the woman he had once loved. And no matter how much time had passed, no matter how many walls he had built around himself, the past was staring him in the face, and for the first time in years, Nathaniel realized, some ghosts don't stay buried. The city hummed around them, cars moving sluggishly through the cold, distant sirens wailing somewhere in the background. But in this small pocket of space, beneath the dull glow of a flickering streetlight, nothing else seemed to exist. Nathaniel stood there, his breath visible in the icy air, waiting for Eleanor to say something, anything that could explain how she ended up here, on the streets, shivering in the dark with 2 children clinging to her. But she didn't. Instead, she adjusted the coat around the little girl, pulling her close as if shielding her from the weight of his questions. His jaw clenched. "Eleanor," he tried again, his voice lower now, almost hesitant. "Tell me what happened." She lifted her eyes to his, and for a second there was something unreadable there, something raw, something fragile. Then, just as quickly, she turned away, her fingers gripping the fabric of her coat like it was the only thing holding her together. Nathaniel took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Eleanor." She exhaled sharply, her breath a cloud in the freezing air. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of years, of struggle, of pain, of stories left untold. "You want to know what happened?" she asked, not looking at him. He nodded, swallowing hard. She let out a small, humorless laugh. "What happened is that I did everything right," she said bitterly. "I worked, I planned, I built a life, and still, life took everything from me." Nathaniel felt something tighten in his chest. She finally turned to him then, and the look in her eyes made his stomach drop. "You think I wanted this?" she whispered, her voice edged with something sharp, something wounded. "You think I woke up one day and decided I wanted to be homeless? To have my kids sleep on cold pavement? To beg for food? Do you think this was some kind of choice?" He felt a pang of guilt, sharp and sudden. "No," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "I didn't mean..." She shook her head. "I lost my job, Nathaniel." Her words were flat, emotionless, like she had told this story too many times to let it hurt anymore. "And when that happened, I lost everything else too. The apartment, the savings, the safety net. It all vanished so fast, I barely had time to breathe." Nathaniel stared at her, speechless. "I tried to find work," she continued. "I tried." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. "But when you have kids, it's not that simple. People don't want to hire a woman who has to take time off for a sick child. They don't want to hire someone who can't stay late because the shelters have curfews. And when you're already on the edge, all it takes is one missed paycheck to send you spiraling." Nathaniel felt his pulse pounding in his ears. She had been alone through all of this. His throat tightened. Where was their father? His voice was careful now, cautious. Eleanor's entire body tensed. "Gone," she said again, just like before. But this time there was something colder in her voice. Nathaniel didn't push. Instead, he let his gaze shift back to the children. The little girl had her face pressed against Eleanor's side, her small body curled into itself. The boy, still stiff, still wary, stood beside her like a soldier. Nathaniel inhaled deeply. "How long have you been on the streets?" Eleanor hesitated. "Too long." That was the answer he saw in her face, even before she said it. She looked away, her lips pressing into a thin line. Nathaniel swallowed. He had spent years making ruthless decisions, cutting off emotions to focus on power, on wealth, on control. He had mastered the art of detachment. But this was Eleanor. And no matter how much he tried to bury it, that still meant something. He exhaled slowly. "Come with me." Her head snapped up, eyes wide with surprise. "What?" "You heard me." His voice was firm now, steady. "You and the kids, come with me. You can't stay out here." Eleanor's jaw clenched. "No." Nathaniel frowned. "Eleanor, I said no." Her voice was steel now, a sharp contrast to the vulnerability she had shown just moments ago. Nathaniel exhaled through his nose, his patience thinning. "Why?" She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze head-on. "Because I don't need your pity." Nathaniel's expression darkened. "This isn't pity. It's reality," he said sharply. "It's freezing, Eleanor. Your daughter can barely stand from the cold. You have nowhere to go." Eleanor flinched at that, but she didn't look away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, softly, so softly, he almost didn't hear it, she said, "I don't trust you." Nathaniel stilled. The words shouldn't have stung. They shouldn't have mattered. But they did, and yet he understood. He had left her behind once. Why should she believe that he wouldn't do it again? A heavy silence settled between them. Then, slowly, Nathaniel did something he hadn't done in years. He let down his guard. He stepped forward carefully, his voice quieter this time. "Eleanor." She didn't move. "I don't know what happened between us," he admitted. "I don't know how things fell apart, but I do know this. You don't deserve this." His voice softened, and neither do they. He gestured to the children. Eleanor's shoulders tensed. For the first time since their encounter, her defenses faltered. Just for a second. Nathaniel seized the moment. "I'm not asking you to trust me." His voice was steady now. "I'm just asking you to let me help." Eleanor closed her eyes for a long moment. Nathaniel could see the battle happening inside her, the fight between pride and desperation, between survival and stubbornness. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she exhaled shakily. Then, barely above a whisper, "Okay." The cold was relentless, slicing through the dark streets of Ashford like an unforgiving blade. The city carried on around them, cars speeding past, the glow of distant streetlights flickering against wet pavement, the murmurs of strangers lost in their own worlds. But in this small, frozen pocket of the night, time seemed to stand still. Eleanor's whispered "okay" still hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. Nathaniel exhaled, releasing a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He should have felt victorious. She had agreed. But as he looked at her, standing there, her body stiff with hesitation, her eyes filled with something between exhaustion and quiet defeat, he realized this wasn't a victory. This was survival. She wasn't choosing to trust him. She was choosing for her children. The little girl whimpered, curling deeper into her mother's embrace, her tiny body trembling. The boy remained silent, his face a mask of quiet suspicion, his grip on Eleanor's coat tightening as if preparing for her to change her mind. Nathaniel took a slow breath and pulled his phone from his pocket. "I'll call my driver." Eleanor's head snapped up, eyes narrowing. "No." Nathaniel frowned. "No, I'm not getting into some blacked-out car and being driven off like some problem you're fixing," she said, her voice sharp, her spine straightening despite the exhaustion weighing her down. "If we're doing this, we're doing it on my terms." Nathaniel studied her for a moment, then slipped his phone back into his pocket. "All right," he said carefully. "We'll walk." Eleanor blinked, clearly not expecting him to concede so easily. It was cold, freezing actually. Every rational part of him wanted to argue, to insist on the warmth of his car, to shield them from the bitter wind that gnawed at exposed skin. But Eleanor wasn't just anyone, and he knew better than to push her when her back was already against the wall. He pulled off his cashmere scarf and stepped forward. She stiffened instantly, her eyes flashing with warning. Nathaniel stopped, lifting his hands slightly. "It's just a scarf, Eleanor. Let me help." Her gaze flickered between him and the scarf before she finally reluctantly accepted it. She wrapped it carefully around the little girl, tucking the ends into her coat. Nathaniel watched as the child immediately burrowed into the warmth, her tiny fingers grasping the soft fabric. The sight did something strange to his chest. Without another word, Eleanor adjusted her grip on her daughter, took the boy's hand, and stepped forward. Nathaniel fell into step beside them. The walk was silent at first. The only sounds were the occasional car passing by, the distant wail of a siren, the rhythmic crunch of their footsteps on the pavement. Nathaniel found himself glancing at Eleanor when she wasn't looking, his mind tangled in questions he wasn't sure how to ask. How long had she been fighting like this? How many nights had she spent out here, freezing, alone, scared? And why? Why the hell hadn't he known? His jaw tightened, frustration curling in his gut. "You're angry," Eleanor said suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet. Nathaniel blinked, turning to her. "I'm not." She let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You always did lie when you didn't know what to say." His lips pressed into a thin line. He inhaled sharply, choosing his words carefully. "I don't understand how this happened." Eleanor didn't answer right away. Instead, she kept walking, her grip tightening around her son's small hand. Then quietly, "Neither do I." Nathaniel looked at her then, really looked. The weight in her eyes, the years of exhaustion etched into her face, the quiet grief she carried in the slump of her shoulders. He had spent so many years convincing himself that the past didn't matter, that what they had was gone, buried beneath time and ambition. But looking at her now, at what life had done to her, at what she had endured, it mattered. It had always mattered. They reached his building sooner than expected, a sleek, modern high-rise standing in stark contrast to the world they had just walked through. The lobby glowed with warm golden light, a sharp difference from the cold streets behind them. Eleanor hesitated just outside the entrance. Nathaniel turned to her, his voice softer this time. "Come inside." She didn't move, her son's hand tightened in hers. Nathaniel took a small step forward. "I know this is hard," he said carefully, "but you're safe here." Eleanor swallowed, her gaze flickering to the glass doors, to the warmth waiting inside, then back to her children. The little girl shivered again. Eleanor closed her eyes for a brief moment. Then, with a quiet breath, she stepped inside. The warmth hit Eleanor the moment she stepped inside. It was overwhelming, almost suffocating after the relentless cold outside. The golden glow of the lobby lights cast everything in a soft, welcoming hue, but she couldn't shake the tension coiled in her chest. She didn't belong here. The polished marble floors, the towering glass walls, the sleek modern furniture, it was a world apart from where she had just been. The contrast was dizzying. Her daughter stirred against her chest, tiny fingers gripping at the scarf Nathaniel had given her, while her son hovered close, his eyes darting around as if expecting someone to tell them to leave. Eleanor knew exactly how he felt. Nathaniel stepped ahead, giving a small nod to the concierge, a man dressed in a crisp navy suit who didn't even blink at the sight of them. That surprised her. She had expected judgment, a sneer, a look that said, "You don't belong here." But there was nothing, just the smooth efficiency of luxury, of a world that operated without friction. Nathaniel turned to her, his voice softer now. "Let's go upstairs." Eleanor hesitated. Everything inside her screamed at her to turn around, to run. But then, her daughter whimpered, burying her face in Eleanor's neck. She felt the little girl's body trembling, not just from the cold, but from sheer exhaustion. Her son, though silent, was visibly swaying on his feet, his small hands still curled into fists, as if prepared for a fight that never came. She swallowed. There was no choice. With a slow, shaky breath, she nodded. Nathaniel led them to the elevator, pressing the button for the penthouse. Eleanor's stomach twisted. Of course. The doors slid shut with a quiet chime, and the ascent began. Silence stretched between them. The only sound was the faint hum of the elevator. Eleanor forced herself to focus on the numbers flickering above the doors. 16, 17, 18. Nathaniel stood beside her, hands in the pockets of his expensive coat, his face unreadable. She hated this. The feeling of being trapped in a space too small, too quiet. The sensation of standing beside someone who once knew every part of her and now felt like a stranger. When the doors finally opened, Eleanor stepped out quickly, almost colliding with the sheer vastness of the space in front of her. The penthouse was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering city skyline, stretching out into the darkness like a sea of endless lights. The furniture was sleek, modern, muted tones of gray and navy, with soft lighting that made everything feel expensive rather than welcoming. This wasn't a home. It was a fortress. And yet it smelled like him. That familiar scent, clean, sharp, something deep and warm beneath it. She hated that she still remembered. Nathaniel set his keys down on a glass table near the entrance, then turned back to her. "Do you want something to eat?" Eleanor tensed. She didn't want charity. She didn't want to feel small. But before she could respond, her son's voice cut through the air. "Mommy, I'm hungry." Her heart clenched. Nathaniel met her gaze, his expression softer now, and for the first time she saw it. The guilt, not judgment, guilt. She exhaled, nodding once. Nathaniel disappeared down a hallway, and Eleanor hesitated before stepping further inside. The heat from the penthouse was starting to sink into her bones, making her feel heavier, sleepier. Her son stayed close, but his posture had shifted. He wasn't afraid anymore, just uncertain. The kitchen was massive, too massive. Stainless steel appliances, pristine countertops, everything looking like it had been designed more for show than function. Nathaniel was already moving, pulling things from the fridge, eggs, bread, cheese. Eleanor frowned. "You cook?" Nathaniel glanced at her, then shrugged. "Not often." She didn't believe him. Minutes later, the smell of eggs and toasted bread filled the air, a warmth settling over the room that had nothing to do with the penthouse's temperature. Nathaniel placed 2 plates in front of the children first. Scrambled eggs, toast with butter, sliced apples on the side. Eleanor watched as her son hesitated, then slowly picked up his fork. She could feel the hunger in them, the way they tried to eat at a normal pace, but couldn't quite control it. Nathaniel said nothing. He just sat across from them, watching with something unreadable in his eyes. Eleanor swallowed. This was dangerous. Not the place, not the food, the feeling of safety, of warmth, of something dangerously close to relief. Nathaniel finally spoke. "You should rest." Eleanor tensed. She shook her head. "You're exhausted, Eleanor." She wanted to argue, to push back, to remind him that she had survived without him all this time. But her body betrayed her. The fatigue was bone deep, the weight of weeks, months of running, of sleeping in doorways, of never knowing if the next morning would bring help or danger. It was crushing her. She exhaled shakily, rubbing a hand over her face. Nathaniel's voice was quieter this time. "There's a guest room." Eleanor hesitated. She had spent so long fighting, clawing for every inch, every moment of security. Accepting this, accepting his help, felt too close to surrender. But then, her son let out a small yawn, and her daughter was already slumped against her, breathing slow and steady, the warmth of a full belly pulling her into sleep. Eleanor closed her eyes. Maybe, just for tonight, maybe she could let herself rest. The city outside was a blur of distant lights, stretching endlessly beyond the towering glass walls of Nathaniel's penthouse. Ashford never slept, but inside the world had gone silent. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed in the guest room, her body heavy with exhaustion, her mind racing too fast to rest. The sheets beneath her were impossibly soft, far too luxurious for someone who had spent months on hard pavement, curled against cold concrete walls, shielding her children from the wind. She should have felt grateful. Instead, she felt trapped. This place wasn't hers. This life wasn't hers. And the man in the next room, the one who had once been her entire world, now felt like a stranger wearing a familiar face. The past was pressing in, suffocating, clawing at the edges of her mind. She could still smell the faint scent of Nathaniel's cologne in the fabric of the clothes he had given her. His clothes, clean and warm, replacing the threadbare layers she had worn for too long. It felt wrong. It felt like a lie. A soft knock at the door made her jolt. She turned, pulse quickening, but didn't answer. The door cracked open anyway. Nathaniel hesitated in the doorway, hands shoved into the pockets of his sweatpants. He looked different like this, less polished, less controlled. His dress shirt was gone, replaced by a simple t-shirt, his sleeves pushed up, revealing forearms she had traced with her fingers once upon a time. "Can I come in?" Eleanor exhaled slowly. She should have told him no. Instead, she nodded. Nathaniel stepped inside, lingering by the window. He didn't sit. He didn't move closer. He just stood there, silhouetted by the city lights behind him, the weight of something unspoken settling between them. "I need to know," he said, voice low, steady. "I need to understand what happened." Eleanor swallowed. She knew this conversation was inevitable, but that didn't make it easier. Nathaniel ran a hand through his hair, his frustration barely contained. "I thought you left me," he admitted, his jaw tightening. "One day, you were there, and then you weren't. No note, no calls, just gone." Eleanor's chest tightened. "That's what you think," she whispered. Nathaniel turned to her fully now, his expression unreadable. "That's what I was told." A slow, bitter laugh slipped from her lips. "Told?" Her hands curled into fists in her lap. "Told by who, Nathaniel?" He hesitated. That was all she needed. Eleanor shook her head, looking away. "Of course. I should have known," she murmured, half to herself. Nathaniel took a slow step closer. "Eleanor," he said carefully, "tell me what happened." She inhaled sharply, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "You want to know what happened?" Her voice wavered, but she didn't stop. "I tried to see you, Nathaniel. I tried, but your people, your security, your assistants, made it clear that you didn't want me anywhere near you." Nathaniel's face hardened. "That's not possible." Eleanor let out a hollow laugh. "You think I'm lying?" "I think," he exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't know what to think." Silence stretched between them. Eleanor looked away, her gaze drifting to the window, to the vast city below. "I found out I was pregnant," she whispered. Nathaniel stilled. Her fingers tightened around the fabric of her borrowed clothes, her breathing uneven. "I was scared," she admitted. "I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how you'd react, but I wanted to tell you. I tried." Her voice broke slightly. "I tried so many times." Nathaniel's throat worked as he swallowed. "You never got my messages," he said, more to himself than to her. Eleanor let out a sharp, pained breath. "Did you even look for me, Nathaniel?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. The question hit like a physical blow. Nathaniel didn't answer right away. He had, at first, but when weeks turned into months, when every attempt to reach her was met with silence, when he had been told she had moved on, had chosen a different life, had left him behind, he had believed it. Because believing it was easier than accepting the possibility that something was wrong. That maybe, just maybe, he had lost her not by choice, but by design. A sick feeling curled in his stomach. "Who told you I left?" Eleanor pressed. Nathaniel hesitated. Then quietly, "My father." Eleanor's breath caught. She let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "Of course," she murmured. "Of course, it was him." Nathaniel felt his chest tighten. His father had never approved of Eleanor. She wasn't from the right family, the right circle. She had been too independent, too strong-willed, but he wouldn't have gone this far, would he? Nathaniel's mind raced, piecing together fragments of the past, conversations he had brushed off, warnings disguised as fatherly concern. All the things he should have questioned, all the things he didn't. A cold, sinking realization settled in his gut. "I believed him," he admitted, the words like acid on his tongue. "When he said you were gone, that you didn't want me." Eleanor's breath hitched. She turned to him, eyes shining with something dangerously close to betrayal. Nathaniel stepped closer, his voice rough, pained. "I'm so sorry, Eleanor." Her lips parted slightly, like she wanted to say something, but no words came. The silence between them was deafening. The past was no longer just a memory. It was here, between them, waiting to be rewritten. The air inside the penthouse felt heavier now, as if the weight of the past had settled into the walls, into the floor, into the space between them. Nathaniel stood frozen, his confession still lingering in the air, a truth too bitter to swallow. Eleanor didn't move. She just stared at him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her breathing slow and controlled, too controlled. Nathaniel had seen her angry before. He had seen her defiant, passionate, unshaken. But this was different. This was betrayal. His own father had ripped them apart, had fed him lies, had stolen everything, and he had let it happen. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. Eleanor was the first to break it. "So that's it?" Her voice was quiet, but there was no softness in it, just exhaustion, just disbelief. Nathaniel opened his mouth, then closed it. What could he say? That he had been blind? That he had been so consumed with building his empire, proving his worth, that he hadn't questioned the one man who had always controlled his life. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Eleanor let out a sharp breath and shook her head. "You believed him," she murmured, without question. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. "Eleanor, did you even try to find me?" The question hit like a punch to the gut. Yes. No. Not the way he should have. "I thought you were gone," he admitted, voice hoarse. "I thought you had moved on?" She let out a bitter laugh. "You thought I had just disappeared? That I had walked away without a word?" Nathaniel swallowed hard. When she put it like that, it sounded insane. Because it was. How had he not seen it before? How had he not fought harder? "I didn't know," he said, his voice lower now. "I didn't know what he had done." Eleanor's eyes flashed. "And now that you do?" Nathaniel took a slow step toward her. "I want to fix this." She let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "Fix this?" Her voice cracked on the words. "Nathaniel, you can't fix this. You can't undo years of pain, years of struggling, years of wondering why the man I loved didn't care enough to come find me." Nathaniel's chest tightened. "I do care," he said, almost desperate now. "I never stopped." Eleanor's gaze softened for a fraction of a second, just a second, but then her guard was back up. She turned away, crossing her arms over her chest. Nathaniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Eleanor, I can't change the past," he said, his voice quieter now. "But I can change right now. I can help you. Let me help you." She was silent for a long time. Then finally she turned back to him, her expression unreadable. "I don't need your pity, Nathaniel." "It's not pity." She raised an eyebrow. No, he said firmly. "It's guilt. It's regret. It's..." He hesitated. "It's me trying to do the right thing, even if I'm years too late." Eleanor studied him, her gaze sharp, assessing. "You can't just throw money at this and expect it to fix everything," she said. Nathaniel shook his head. "That's not what I'm doing." "Then what are you doing?" Nathaniel took another step closer. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I know I can't let you walk out of here and go back to the streets." Eleanor let out a slow breath, looking away. "I don't know if I can trust you." Nathaniel's heart clenched. He nodded. "Then let me prove that you can." Eleanor didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned slightly, glancing toward the hallway where her children were sleeping. Nathaniel watched her, the way her shoulders rose and fell with each deep breath, the way she bit her lip, the way she hesitated. That hesitation was everything. It meant that, despite everything, despite the pain, despite the anger, some part of her wanted to believe him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Eleanor turned back to him. Her voice was soft but steady. "I'll stay," she said. "For them, not for you." Nathaniel swallowed hard and nodded. For now, that was enough. The rain came in slow, steady waves against the massive windows of the penthouse, soft drizzles tapping against the glass, filling the silence between them. It was late, well past midnight, but neither Nathaniel nor Eleanor could sleep. She sat curled up in an oversized chair near the fireplace, her arms wrapped protectively around herself, her gaze unfocused as she stared into the flames. Nathaniel stood a few feet away, leaning against the kitchen counter, gripping a half-empty glass of whiskey that he hadn't taken a sip from. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. She had agreed to stay. For the children, not for him. And yet there was something in the way she kept sneaking glances at him when she thought he wasn't looking. Something in the way her fingers traced absent patterns against the fabric of the chair, a nervous habit he still remembered. He took a breath, forcing himself to say what had been weighing on his mind since their conversation hours ago. "I need to know something," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Eleanor didn't look at him. "I'm tired, Nathaniel." "I know," he said, softer now, "but I need to know the truth." She let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "Haven't we already been over that?" Nathaniel exhaled sharply. "Not all of it." Eleanor shifted in the chair, her jaw tightening, her hands gripping her arms a little too tightly. "You said my father made sure you couldn't reach me," Nathaniel continued, "that he kept us apart." She gave a small nod. Nathaniel clenched his teeth. "How?" Eleanor's shoulders stiffened. She hesitated, like she wasn't sure if she wanted to go back there to that part of her past. Then, finally, she exhaled slowly and lifted her gaze to his. "He paid me off," she said. Nathaniel felt the floor tilt beneath him. "What?" Eleanor's expression was unreadable, but there was something behind her eyes, something bitter. "Your father came to see me," she said, her voice quieter now. "Not long after I found out I was pregnant. He said you were too busy to deal with distractions." Nathaniel's grip on the glass tightened. "That's what he called me, a distraction, a problem that needed to be handled." Eleanor let out a sharp breath. "He offered me money, enough to disappear, enough to never look back." Nathaniel's pulse roared in his ears. He had been played. All these years, he thought she had left, thought she had moved on, thought she had chosen a different life. But all along, it had been his own father. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice rough, barely controlled. Eleanor let out a hollow laugh. "Tell you?" She shook her head. "Nathaniel, I tried." Her voice wavered, but she kept going. "I went to your office. I called. I wrote you letters." She swallowed hard. "I begged." Nathaniel shut his eyes. He had never seen those letters, never gotten those calls. His father had cut her off completely, and Nathaniel had let him. His throat tightened, rage curling in his chest like a living thing, burning through every rational thought. "I'm gonna kill him." Eleanor huffed a humorless laugh. "You're too late for that. He's already dead." Nathaniel's head snapped up. "What?" Eleanor shrugged, shifting in her chair. "Heart attack, about 2 years ago." Nathaniel's stomach twisted. His father had died with this secret, with this lie. And now, there was no one left to blame, just himself. He turned away, setting the untouched whiskey down with a little more force than necessary. His hands trembled. All the years he had spent hating her, all the nights he had convinced himself she had never loved him enough to stay, it had all been a lie. Eleanor watched him for a moment before speaking again, her voice softer now. "You were never supposed to find out." Nathaniel turned to her, his jaw tightening. "What does that mean?" She exhaled. "I spent years trying to reach you, but after a while, I gave up." She looked away. "I stopped hoping." Nathaniel's heart ached at those words. He had been right there, living in his world of luxury and power while she was fighting to survive. The guilt was suffocating. He took a slow step toward her. "I would have come for you, Eleanor," he said, his voice rough. "I would have fought for you." She finally looked at him, something flickering in her eyes. "But you didn't." Nathaniel inhaled sharply. She wasn't wrong. And that was what hurt the most. He let the silence settle between them, heavy with regret, with everything left unsaid. Then, quietly, Eleanor turned away again, curling into herself, as if bracing for something she wasn't ready to face. Nathaniel watched her, his mind racing. For years, he had thought the past was behind him, that she was gone, that whatever they had was long buried. But now he wasn't so sure. The rain hadn't stopped. It drummed steadily against the massive glass windows, a rhythmic pulse that filled the silence between them. Eleanor remained in the chair by the fireplace, her body curled inward, her fingers tracing absent patterns on the fabric of her borrowed clothes. Nathaniel hadn't moved from where he stood, his jaw clenched, his mind tangled in the web of revelations that had unraveled before him. His father had stolen everything from him, from them. And he had let it happen. The guilt was a living thing inside him, clawing at his ribs. Eleanor finally broke the silence. "So what now?" Her voice was quiet, measured, but there was something beneath it, something raw, something cautious. Nathaniel exhaled sharply. "I don't know." Eleanor let out a soft, bitter laugh. "Honest, that's new." He ran a hand over his face. He hesitated, then turned to her, his voice lower now. "I just want to fix this." She lifted her head slowly, meeting his gaze with eyes that held years of unspoken pain. "You can't." Nathaniel's chest tightened. "You think I don't know that?" he said, stepping closer. "I can't undo the past, Eleanor. I can't change what happened, but I can." "What?" she interrupted, sitting up straighter. "What can you do, Nathaniel? You think you can just step back into my life and make everything right? You think you can erase the years I spent alone, struggling, fighting for every single thing while you were up here in your perfect world?" Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. "Do you know what it's like to go hungry just so your kids can eat? Do you know what it's like to wake up in the middle of the night in a shelter, terrified that someone will take them from you? Do you know how it feels to be invisible? To have people look through you like you don't exist?" Nathaniel flinched. He had spent his life commanding attention, shaping the world around him to fit his vision. He had never known what it was like to be powerless. He took another step toward her, his voice softer now. "I don't know, Eleanor," he admitted, "but I want to understand. I want to help." She let out a shaky breath, looking away. Nathaniel hesitated, then spoke again. "Let me take care of you and the kids," he said. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." Eleanor's head snapped back to him, her eyes flashing. "I don't need you to take care of me," she said. "I don't need saving, Nathaniel." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't mean it like that." "Then what did you mean?" He struggled for the right words. He exhaled. "I don't want you to go back out there, not when you have a choice." Eleanor scoffed. "A choice? You think I had a choice when I ended up on the streets? You think I wanted this?" Nathaniel's fists clenched at his sides. "No, damn it, that's not what I meant." "Then what do you mean, Nathaniel?" she pressed, her voice shaking. "Because right now it feels like you just want to fix your guilt, like you want to make this right so you can sleep at night." Her words hit like a slap. Nathaniel took a step back, his breath unsteady. Was that what he was doing? Was he trying to save her to ease his own guilt? The thought made his stomach twist. Eleanor shook her head, standing up. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she admitted. Her voice was quieter now, but it cut just as deep. "I don't know if I can trust you again." Nathaniel swallowed hard. "But I do know this," she continued, looking him in the eyes. "I'm not that girl you left behind, Nathaniel. I don't need you to fix me. I've already done that myself." She turned toward the hallway, toward the room where her children were sleeping. Nathaniel stood there, his heart pounding, watching her walk away. For the first time in his life, he realized this wasn't about him, this was about her, and whether she let him in again wasn't his choice to make. The sun had barely begun to rise, casting a soft, golden hue over the skyline of Ashford. The city below was waking up, stretching into another day of movement, of business, of lives intertwining without ever really touching. But inside Nathaniel Whitmore's penthouse, the world remained still. Eleanor stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, arms wrapped around herself, eyes distant as she stared at the streets far below. She hadn't slept. She had tried. After the conversation, the confrontation with Nathaniel, she had lain awake for hours, listening to the steady breathing of her children in the next room. She had told herself she would figure it out, that by morning she would have a plan. But now that the sun was creeping into the sky, all she felt was uncertainty. Behind her, she heard footsteps. She didn't turn around. Nathaniel hesitated in the doorway. He had changed into a fresh button-down, though the exhaustion in his eyes betrayed the fact that he hadn't slept either. "You're up early," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Eleanor let out a small breath, her fingers tightening against her arms. "Didn't sleep much." Nathaniel nodded slowly. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Finally, Eleanor turned, meeting his gaze. "I think we should go," she said softly. Nathaniel's stomach dropped. Go. He knew it was coming. He had seen it in her eyes last night. The way she had pulled away, the way she had made it clear she wasn't the same girl he had once known. Still, hearing it out loud made something inside him ache in a way he wasn't ready to face. He swallowed hard. "Where?" Eleanor hesitated. She didn't have an answer. She had spent so long surviving that she hadn't thought about what came next. Nathaniel took a careful step toward her. "You don't have to leave," he said. "Not yet." Eleanor exhaled sharply. "Nathaniel, I know," he interrupted gently. "I know you don't trust me. I know this doesn't erase what happened." He ran a hand through his hair, his voice rough with emotion. "But you don't have to do this alone anymore." Eleanor stared at him, something unreadable flickering in her expression. "You think this is easy for me?" she whispered. Nathaniel shook his head. "No." She looked away, blinking hard like she was trying to keep herself together. "I've spent years depending on no one but myself," she admitted. "Every time I got my hopes up, every time I thought things were finally going to be okay, something would happen. Someone would disappoint me. I can't." Her voice broke slightly. "I can't do that again." Nathaniel's chest tightened. "I don't want to disappoint you," he said softly. Eleanor let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You already did." His throat worked as he swallowed. He wanted to say something, anything, to change her mind. But this wasn't about him. He had to let her make her own choice. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Eleanor sighed. "I just need time," she said, "to figure things out." Nathaniel nodded, forcing himself to accept it. "Then take all the time you need." Eleanor looked at him, surprised. "You're not going to try to convince me to stay?" Nathaniel gave her a small, sad smile. "I don't want you to stay because you feel like you owe me something," he said. "I want you to stay because you want to." Eleanor inhaled sharply, like the weight of his words had knocked the air from her lungs. For the first time since their reunion, she didn't feel trapped. For the first time in years, she had a choice. She turned back to the window, the sunlight creeping higher over the city, illuminating the streets, the possibilities, the unknown future waiting for her. She wasn't sure where this road would lead, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't walking it alone. Life has a way of pulling us in unexpected directions. Sometimes the people we love slip through our fingers, not because they chose to leave, but because the world conspired against them. But what would you do if fate gave you a second chance? Would you let the past define you? Would you have the courage to forgive? Or would you fight for the truth, no matter how painful it is? Nathaniel and Eleanor's story is a reminder that sometimes we don't see the full picture until it's too late. But the real question is, how many of us are walking past the truth every single day, too blind to see it? What if there's someone in your life right now who deserves a second chance? What if you've believed a lie for years and it's stopping you from healing? And most importantly, what are you going to do about it? Let's talk about it in the comments below. I want to hear your thoughts. Have you ever experienced a moment that made you question everything? Have you ever lost someone, only to realize later that the truth was different from what you believed? And if this story moved you even a little, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful story like this one. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the truth isn't lost. It's just waiting to be found. See you in the next video.